Ministers can table whenever they wish to. The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the members in the House for having such great confidence in me in spite of the campaign that my colleague from Carleton launched as well. And I was very thankful, Mr. Speaker, that you didn't have to cast the deciding vote in this vote. But I think the government members, who I am very thankful for their support, but I think they're going to be disappointed here in the next few minutes, just as Canadians have been very disappointed in the last year that they've had to face the consequences of having elected the government across from us. And certainly this has been a long year, Mr. Speaker. The economy has slowed down, and obviously it's affecting Canadians across the country. I want to talk a little bit about my area. And
Order. We have resumed debate. I encourage members to take their conversations into the lobbies, or out onto the front lawn, or somewhere other than in here. And I encourage members to listen to the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands, who has the floor. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate that. I did want to take a little bit of time to talk about the impact of this government on my area. And obviously, as you know, the Cypress Hills Grasslands is a large part of southwestern Saskatchewan. Agriculture has been a big issue. And so the agriculture actually has done well over the last few years. The prices have been up. We've had some pretty good crops, but this fall, obviously the snow and the weather has impacted agriculture in a huge way. There's also been quite a change in terms of cattle prices over the last year, so a lot of the cattlemen are facing pressures that they haven't faced over the last couple of years. But certainly one of the things that's helped over the past few years has been the previous government's commitment to trade agreements, signing over 35 trade agreements around the world, and that has impacted agriculture directly in our part of the world. It's certainly been good to see that CETA did not fall apart under this government. It seemed like they did everything they could to create problems in getting CETA implemented, but we see that there was a step here in the last couple of weeks. It looks like it will be implemented at some point in Europe, and that is a good thing. There's a question, I guess, Mr. Speaker, on what is the future of the TPP. We've seen some change in government in the United States coming up. President-elect Trump has made it very clear that he does not support TPP. We believe in this country that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a good thing generally for Canadians, and that certainly having that partnership with those Pacific nations would only benefit us in terms of trade. Second area in my writing that is of great importance to me is oil and gas. The energy sector in our area has been a major factor in our part of the world, and it's unfortunate to see this government and the Alberta government in particular create so much uncertainty for the oil and gas sector in Western Canada. Now, I guess I'm very thankful that I'm from Saskatchewan. We've had a strong government there, a government that's committed to natural resources, a premier who has been willing to speak his mind, a premier who has led the way in many ways around the world in terms of leadership on this issue. And I should mention the carbon capture and storage project that's in place in southeastern Saskatchewan. It's been a huge impact, and it gives an example of what we can do in terms of innovative technology regarding carbon, and so we would expect that this government would have a little bit more interest in those kinds of things that will allow our oil and gas industries to develop responsibly. And I guess obviously one of the things that we would be talking about in that area would be the Keystone Pipeline. This is a pipeline that has been very important to many of us, and actually, Mr. Speaker, I've had pipe laying in my riding now for almost 10 years, and it was for the Keystone Pipeline. The stuff, I think actually some of it has been coated once already because it's laid out long enough that it need to be recoated, but I would certainly love to see that pipeline be underground rather than sitting on top of the ground, and hopefully that will happen here soon. The government across the way has said so far that they're not going to interfere with the Keystone Pipeline construction. We can only take them at their word. We hope that they're not misleading Canadians on this, and certainly we look forward to the revival of interest in Keystone across the border and the movement of them several 100,000 barrels of oil a day down the United States, down to the Gulf, which actually does give us an opportunity to export some of our product and to find new markets as well. So when I hear the Natural Resource Minister saying we're not really that interested in Keystone anymore, we need to remind him that this is an important part of economic development in Western Canada, and he does need to continue to support that. It's going to be interesting to see whether that pipeline will be supported, whether the growth in that sector will be supported by this government. because this pipeline has already been approved in Western Canada, and it needs to move ahead. We don't believe that this government should stand in the way, and hopefully they will keep their word when they say they're not going to do that. I have to tell you, Madam Speaker, that Western Canadians are getting very disenchanted with this government and getting somewhat tired of seeming like they are not being heard at all by this government, particularly on natural resource development. This government's going to need as much help for economic growth as possible. I think we're over a year into their mandate, and they have yet to create one single full-time job, which they should be apologizing to Canadians instead of bragging about their economic platform. We've seen spending is ballooning. It's getting larger all the time. It's growing at an incredible rate. Their deficits are skyrocketing. It doesn't seem like so long ago that we thought it was ridiculous that they were promising $10 billion deficits, and people in our part of the country rejected even that notion. And now certainly we're looking at deficits in the neighborhood of $30 billion, perhaps more, extending out as far as we can see, out to the horizon, out to the future. People are tired of broken promises, and they're already tired of stagnant federal leadership. It's only been a year, and they're already getting tired of what they're seeing. It's just incredible that after all of this and all the noise that we've heard from them, that there hasn't been one full-time job that they can show has been created in this country by their economic plan. So their economic plan has failed. Canadians are already paying for it, and we find out the Liberals are borrowing extra $32 billion over the next 5 years with no reason to believe that things are going to get better. I guess speaking of $30 billion, it takes us somewhat into the area of this new investment bank, infrastructure investment bank that they're proposing around suggesting moving about $35 billion, I understand, into this bank, and it doesn't appear that it's going to be very useful for Canadians or helpful for Canadians to have a large-scale infrastructure bank that protects the investors, these billionaire investors that will come perhaps from other countries and from Canada, and their liabilities will be limited while the taxpayers' liabilities will be infinite. And it doesn't seem like a fair way to treat Canadians. It doesn't seem like a fair way to treat taxpayers. We had a very successful infrastructure program going, and this government just seems bound and determined that they're going to wipe that out just because they can. There's a lot of other things that are taking place that Liberal tax hikes Canadians are facing. Red tape is increasing. It's just making things even worse for Canadians. I guess we remember things like they've canceled the family tax credit for sports and arts classes. They canceled small business tax cuts, and that was significant across the country because at the same time they want to increase CPP premiums, and so businesses and individuals are being tagged for up to $2,200, perhaps even more than that, in order to cover those increases that the Liberals think that they need. That CPP tax hike thing is something that Canadians need to be paying attention to because it doesn't actually impact this generation. It's going to take 20 to 30 to 40 years before it'll be fully realized. So some people are going to be paying into this for a number of years. They'll never get anything out of it, and they don't seem to understand that that's the case. Carbon tax is another issue, Madam Speaker. I spent 6 years on the Natural Resource Committee, and we talked a lot about carbon dioxide, carbon taxes. We talked about carbon exchanges. We talked about putting a price on carbon, and it seemed like every one of these schemes that's being suggested in Canada has been tried somewhere else, and it has failed somewhere else, and now we come late to the game, and we insist on then being part of this whole process. And Madam Speaker, I'm just wondering how much more time do I have? I have 1 minute. Well, Madam Speaker, I would like to move, seconded by the member for Brantford-Brant, that the House do now adjourn.
Grasslands. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must admit I'm a little bit surprised. We just had a vote from a member that wanted to see the House take a break. And, in government, we're here to work, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell members...
Order. The Honourable. Order. I know members are anxious for the House to continue. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have an aggressive agenda as government. We can talk, Mr. Speaker, in regards to the cut to the middle-class tax bracket. We can talk about the Canada Child Benefit Program. We can talk about the substantial increase to the GIS for our seniors. We're lifting seniors out of poverty. We're lifting children out of poverty. We can talk about the investment in Canada's infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, there are so many things that are within this budget and within this government's mandate, and we are disappointed that the member saw fit to actually attempt to adjourn the House. Mr. Speaker, the very bill that we were supposed to and hopeful that we were able to debate today was the issue of the C-26, a historical agreement that would have saw millions of Canadians benefit. My question to the member is very specific. Why did the Conservative Party attempt to adjourn debate when there's so much that Canadians want us to do?
Honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the obvious answer is the best thing for Canadians is if this agenda never sees the light of day. It's unbelievable what's happened since this government's taken over. They haven't created one full-time job yet. The Bank of Canada says the government's new housing rules will cost the economy $6 billion by the end of 2018. Our bank economists around the country are publicly calling out the government, telling them to quit adding additional spending. We see that the GDP growth is going to be lower, 10% lower than has been projected, from 1.4 to 1.2 in 2016, from 2.2 down to 2.2% in 2017. What more do Canadians need to hear but that this government's agenda has been a complete and total failure to this point?
Questions and comments. Order. Order. The Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the Honourable Member's speech with regards to Canadians not being heard and his concern that conditions are being made worse for Canadians. And then I heard our Honourable colleague over the way taking offence to an adjournment motion because he is concerned that there are so many things that we need to do for Canadians. So what I'd like to ask the member is, does he understand and is he concerned that we are debating a motion about CPP enhancements that are ignoring vulnerable people, persons living with disabilities, women who have opted out of the workforce because of child rearing, and these could be fixed with very simple amendments. It's almost disingenuous to hear the rhetoric today. If there really is a genuine desire for us to be addressing and doing the real hard work that this House of Commons needs, I'd like to hear my member talk about how he understands the hypocrisy of this.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
I want to thank the member for a question across the way because she's exactly right. The frustration that Canadians are feeling with having to deal with this government is reaching limits that we haven't seen in decades, probably since the last time the Prime Minister's father was Prime Minister of this country. The reality is we're spending our time talking about CPP premium hikes that are going to impact every employer, every employee across this country that don't come into effect for another 20, 30, and 40 years before people are directly impacted by them. It's going to cost a lot of money. It slows down the economy. Our record is that during the worst economic downturn since the recession, we had the best job creation and economic growth amongst all of the G7. We reduced taxes to their lower point in 50 years, with a family of four saving almost $7,000 a year. And after running a targeted stimulus program that created and maintained approximately 200,000 jobs, we kept our promise, we balanced the budgets, and we left the Liberals with a surplus, and now we've got this disaster that they brought in only 1 year.